because it was the area north of the small southeastern Ghanaian region of Volta and its river, which was also creatively named the Volta. Just like pretty much everywhere in Africa, Burkina Faso is a patchwork of differing ethnicities, religions, and languages. More is spoken by about 52.5% of the population, a little over 12 million people, whilst the francophone population sits at around 22.8%, equating to around 5.5 million. Other languages include Bobo, Samo, Marka, and Fulani, which is used as a lingua franca, which is kind of ironic in a country where French is already spoken, but there's probably a reason for that, which we'll get into later, won't we? You see, the citizens of Burkina Faso, also known as the Burkinabe, are a fiercely independent and proud people. In fact, Burkina Faso literally means land of the upright people. They're also a young people, and we mean that in more ways than one. The country only gained its independence in 1960. The average life expectancy is just over 60, and the median age in the country is 18. Burkina Faso has one of the youngest populations on the planet today. As a nation, it's also growing in both financial and population terms. From a GDP perspective, Burkina Faso, for all of its chaos over the years, has almost never failed to grow economically. Since 1980, the nation has only experienced 3 years of negative economic growth, and most years it experiences a significant GDP percentage rise of around 5%, with some years as high as 11. GDP per capita is 3.29 times higher than it was in 1980, and the country even has the largest gold reserves in all of Africa. Burkina Faso is Africa's fourth largest gold producer too, churning out more than 57 tons of the stuff in 2023, and nationalization efforts are ongoing to ensure that national wealth stays in the country. And that's important because Burkina Faso is a country that is rich in gold and poor in basically everything else. Over 41% of Burkinabe citizens still live below the national poverty line, even though it represents a huge drop from almost 88% in the late 90s. The economy is vulnerable to economic shocks because overwhelmingly its main exports are cotton and gold. Just under half the population don't have access to clean water. Only 21.7% of people had access to electricity in 2023, and there are only 1.46 doctors per 10,000 people. The reality is that living in Burkina Faso today, for a lot of people, is desperately hard, and it's not just due to the poverty or lack of services. The country is also at war. A radical Islamic jihadist insurgency has been raging in the nation since the mid-2010s, which has only continued to grow with time. As of 2026, the recognized government has control of less than half the country. The insurgency has curbed media access, and government restrictions have made the crisis even harder to get information about. The result is displacement, violence, death, and fear. So my question to you then, dear viewer, is how do we end up here? Well, to understand where Burkina Faso is and where it's going, we need to look at where it's been. Burkina Faso's history, just like many countries across the world, but certainly in Africa, goes back many thousands of years to the formation of early agricultural settlements. Now, as per most of our videos, when a country has thousands of years of history to unpack in a 30-minute YouTube video, we're going to be glossing over a lot of really interesting pre-colonial history. If you want a comprehensive breakdown of the entire history of modern Burkina Faso, this isn't the place to find it. This is the place where you come to watch a bald British man tell you about the world. Hello there, so strap in, because this is going to move rather quickly. The Bura culture was an Iron Age civilization centered on the lower Niger River Valley in what is now Niger and Burkina Faso from roughly the 3rd to the 13th centuries. Around 1000 AD, the Mosai kingdoms, also known as the Mosai Empire, would first establish themselves here. They were a group of kingdoms within modern-day Burkina Faso that dominated the Upper Volta River region. The largest Mossi kingdom was called Ouagadougou, which the observant among you will remember is the name of the nation's modern capital city. The Mossi kingdoms lasted for about 900 years, with significant connections to the Mali Empire, as well as the Fula kingdoms, which were jihadist kingdoms that first emerged in the 18th century. This is where the Fulani language emerged that is the lingua franca in Burkina Faso today, and the Fulani people are a significant ethnic group within the country. The Mossi kingdoms would last until the late 1890s, when the great spectre of European colonialism would arrive on the back of French warships. In 1884, at the Berlin Conference, the European nations had divided up Africa during the infamous scramble for the continent, and within just a few decades, what was an incredibly complex and varied system of tribes and alliances across the continent would be reduced to mostly European territory, enforced at the barrel of a gun. The French would come out of the scramble particularly strongly, establishing colonies in the territory that currently makes up the nations of, deep breath here, Benin, Ivory Coast, Guinea, Mali, Mauritania, Senegal, Algeria, Tunisia, Djibouti, Madagascar, most of Chad, most of the Central African Republic, most of the Republic of Congo, most of Gabon, some of Libya, some of Morocco, and of course Burkina Faso. I did it with breath to spare. They would also add Togo and Cameroon after the German defeat in World War I led to a colony transfer, which meant French colonies made up almost 40% of Africa's landmass in the early 20th century. Burkina Faso had been invaded and made a French protectorate in 1898, but it wasn't a standalone region yet, more of a combined one with the territories of Upper Senegal and Niger. However, that didn't mean that there weren't people who lived here who were fiercely protective of their home and didn't take kindly to European settlers siphoning money and resources out of it. From 1915 to 1917, an anti-colonial rebellion in modern Burkina Faso and Mali took place called the Volta Barni War. Despite the African forces mustering up to 20,000 fighters and winning initial engagements, it would eventually be crushed under the boot of French munitions. But it wasn't all bad, though. In 1919, French Upper Volta was officially created, which established the territory which would go on to be modern Burkina Faso, although the borders were a bit different. For all intents and purposes, this is where Burkina Faso began. Unfortunately, the region, which was created for various economic reasons, failed to thrive, and after failed attempts to promote cotton as an export crop, Upper Volta was officially dissolved in 1932. However, don't despair, as World War II's aftermath would see Upper Volta revived in 1947, following post-war anti-colonial movements. Not only would this officially establish the modern borders of Burkina Faso, but it would also be the second time that the future Burkinabe would try to take a hold of their own destiny, which was an important founding ethos of the state. Independence, sovereignty, self-reliance, these were the founding pillars on which a national identity would soon sit. By 1958, Upper Volta gained self-governance status and joined the Franco-African community, fully gaining its independence in 1960. This is kind of wild when you actually think about it. It's like Burkina Faso was going for the any percent speedrun record for getting colonized, going from pre-colonial to post-colonial in just 62 years, less than a single lifetime. Compare that to another West African nation like Cape Verde, which the Portuguese had held for half a millennia, whilst other future nations were serving as colonies for hundreds of years. But that actually really matters for the Burkinabe, where some still remembered pre-colonial times during the French occupation. This helped reinforce that fiercely independent mindset, because as far as the people who had lived here were concerned, French colonization was just the most recent speck on a lengthy timeline. So then, 1960, a glistening wave of independence had swept over the Upper Volta. From here, be nothing but smooth sailing, right? Well, no, of course not, because remember when we said that Burkina Faso was speedrunning colonialism? It also decided it wasn't hanging around much in the post-colonial period either. And soon, all the realities of hard-fought independence were coming to the fore. In 1960, Maurice Yamaogo was made the new president of Upper Volta, which was set to be a democratic state. However, the country soon devolved into one-party rule, dictatorship, and corruption. There's a lot more to it than that, but just long story short, Upper Volta would experience what we're calling coup number 1 by 1966, and that's probably a hint that there are going to be more, and this ended the nation's speed date with civilian rule. The army took over, forming a military government under the control of Lieutenant Colonel Sangoulé Lamazana, and the constitution was suspended. The nation would live under this military rule for the next decade, but in 1976 a new constitution was brought forward to re-establish civilian governance following a 4-year transition period. Lamazana remained, being re-elected as Upper Volta president in 1978. But you should know by now that in 20th century post-colonial Africa, the average term of an elected president was about 5 minutes, and in 1980, coup number 2 would come. Actually, it kind of makes sense to call it coup number 2 because it was a bit shit. The incredibly unimpressed-looking Colonel Sai Zerbo overthrew Lamazana in a bloodless coup that re-established military junta rule over the country. And that's all we have to say about him because he was almost immediately ousted in 1982 during coup number 3. Zerbo was overthrown by Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo and the Council of Popular Salvation, which sounds like the name of a brilliant folk band from the 1960s. But instead of bringing the country together, all it really did was usher in an era of power struggles and political unrest. Such instability had the nation at a fever pitch. This new country had had 3 coups in 6 years. Someone needed to take the reins, someone with bold new ideas about Upper Volta and its place in the world. Someone like Thomas Sankara. And with coup number 4 taking place a year later in 1983, that's exactly what happened. Sankara was not even a senior officer in the army, being at the junior rank of captain and just 33 years old, which made him one of the youngest leaders in the entire world. He had been made president in 1983, but disputes amongst the power structure led to his house arrest, at which point a coup was organized on his behalf. Sankara was a revolutionary in every sense of the word. Between his red military beret being permanently glued to his scalp and his pan-African Marxist anti-imperialist stance, he commanded attention, and as a result, many saw him as something akin to Africa's Che Guevara. Sankara's rule would usher in an unprecedented series of social, ecological, and economic reforms that were part of what he referred to as the People's Democratic Revolution, although, to be frank, it was about as democratic as a ham sandwich. Still, what it certainly was a revolution for the people. His government would prioritize public health, anti-corruption efforts, education, women's rights, and economic self-reliance. This is one of those rare instances of an undemocratic leader who chooses to try and lift the nation up instead of robbing it blind. And to a people who had faced little other than corrupt instability and colonialism with extra steps since independence, it's easy to see why he was popular. For one, the man lived and breathed Burkina Faso. Sankara was the one who renamed the country Burkina Faso in 1984, and he even personally wrote the national anthem. Many of his policy choices were extremely popular and genuinely positive for the nation. He sold the government's fleet of luxury cars and reduced ministers' salaries across the board, including his own. He initiated a nationwide literacy campaign, increasing the literacy rate from 13% in 1983 to 73% in just 4 years. He started an initiative that planted 10 million trees in the nation to help stave off desertification, and he introduced widespread vaccination campaigns, significantly lowering child mortality. He also banned female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and polygamy, championing women's rights as crucial to the overall revolution. He stated that, quote, "Comrades, there is no true social revolution without the liberation of women," end quote. Supporters largely remembered the era as a bold attempt to empower ordinary Burkinabe people and a break from colonial dependency. This is everything the country had always wanted, a country run by Africans for Africans. But Sankara also had his downsides. History might sand off the sharper edges of political figures over time, but some of his actions were questionable at best and illegal at worst. Because he was a fierce anti-imperialist, Sankara refused all foreign aid to enter Burkina Faso, including financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund. Sankara's reasoning for this was that supranational organizations like the IMF are little more than colonialism in disguise. In one sense, he's right. Foreign aid is used all the time to prop up a meager existence for citizens whilst corrupt politicians had their noses in the trough. But Sankara wasn't corrupt, and some of that money could really have helped a lot of Burkinabe. But he was wary of an African nation owing anything to anyone, even if it meant greater poverty for his citizens now. He's reported to have said, quote, "He who feeds you controls you." And that pretty much gets the sentiment across. Sankara also had more authoritarian tendencies, including political repression, revolutionary tribunals, and arbitrary detention of political opponents. For all the good Sankara did for his nation in a short time, and there was a lot of good, we shouldn't forget the brutality either. Ultimately, his reign would be cut short by coup number 5 in 1987, where he would be killed. This was organized by Blaise Compaoré, who helped organize the 1983 coup that brought Sankara to power in the first place, claiming Sankara had hurt the nation's economy and foreign relations. Compaoré's rule was a more stable one, but not a better one, reversing Sankara's economic policies and building a more conventional African state backed by Western donors. He would remain in power for the next 27 years, even surviving a few coup attempts along the way. He held elections in 1990, allowed political parties to return, and introduced new democratic reforms, but his elections were not free or fair, and with his thumb on the scale, people boycotted it. The Burkinabe spirit would show itself again in 1998, though, when, after the state's extrajudicial killing of journalist Norbert Zongo, tens of thousands of citizens took to the streets in protest. Compaoré relented by adding term limits to the constitution. He would give up further concessions after more unrest in 2011. His power was waning. In 2014, he tried to do something about that, which backfired immediately. You remember those term limits he introduced? Well, yeah, those pesky things were getting in the way of him becoming president for life, and so when he tried to get rid of them, a popular uprising ensued that quickly turned into a revolution, which also sort of counts as coup number 6. The country's National Assembly building was burned and looted by protesters, and soon a transitional government paved the way for democratic renewal. This was one of the first glimmers of hope that the Burkinabe had had since Sankara was in charge. This revolution was justice for his murder and the murder of Norbert Zongo. It was Sankara who called the country the land of the upright people. Well, here were the people standing upright, and they were taking it back. But they weren't the only ones who wanted it. At the same time, in 2015, a radical jihadist insurgency that had been spreading through the Maghreb reached Burkina Faso. They were affiliated with the likes of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, so let's just say that they weren't everybody hold hands and let's get along types. The first attack was on a gendarmerie that year. It wouldn't be the last. Meanwhile, the Transitionary Council was facing its own internal crisis as the infamous Presidential Security Regiment, the armed wing of ex-President Compaore's regime, interrupted a government council meeting and took the transitionary government hostage. On national television, a spokesman declared a coup, dissolved the government and the parliament, and removed the president. But the Burkinabe's indomitable spirit rose again to meet the challenge. Crowds reacted with anger, broadly mobilizing and launching a general strike that paralyzed the country. The regular army sided with the people and the coup was thwarted. By the end of 2015, genuine, democratic, presidential and legislative elections took place in which Roch March Christian Kabore became president. Under Kabore's government, things started to improve in some areas. The number of paved roads in the countries increased by over 25%, and free healthcare for children up to 5 years old was implemented. But there was a jihadist insurgency-shaped elephant in the room, which was getting worse. The nation had been relatively stable for the last 3 decades under Compaore, so nobody expected it when in 2016 the insurgency struck right in the heart of the nation, Ouagadougou, specifically the Splendid Hotel and Cappuccino restaurant. 28 people were killed, 56 were wounded in the siege. Come 2018, and there was an attack on the French embassy, as well as a military HQ. By 2019, the insurgency was starting to get out of control in Burkina Faso, spreading from the north of the nation to the east. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, homegrown terror cells, militias, and rebel groups were all fighting and wrestling for control of the nation. After all, those gold mines would make a worthy prize for any warlord. In the 5 years before Kabore came to power, Burkina Faso saw just 55 fatalities related to conflict. In the 5 years after, there were 4,939, which is an increase of about 9,000%. By 2022, the number had hit 10,000. 2 million people, just under 10% of the country's population, were displaced. Famine was growing. Massacres were common. Atrocities in the countryside terrorized the locals and terrified those in the cities that they would be next. The government was losing its grip on the country. It couldn't even hold voter registration in more than 17% of the nation's municipalities. Burkina Faso was burning on its knees, just like it was 40 years prior. Back then, someone like Thomas Sankara was able to step through the chaos and be the light in the dark that the Burkinabe needed. But who would lead them now? Well, let me introduce you to coup number 7. In January of 2022, Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba seized power, deposing President Kabore. And to be honest, that's all you need to know about him because he was unable to deal with the insurgency. I'm sure you can tell what's coming next. Yes, magical coup number 8 arrived. That rarely seen double coup in a single year. A rather impressive feat for any country. The successive coups ousting the democratically elected government, even in the midst of the impending military crisis, got Burkina Faso kicked out of the African Union, and they left the regional ECOWAS group after getting sanctioned. So then, who was going to take charge of the nation? Who would be the hero that Burkina Faso needed in its darkest hour? Well, nostalgia's a hell of a drug, isn't it? Enter Captain Ibrahim Traoré, just 34 years old when he came to power in 2022, and I tell you what, that beret looks a bit familiar, doesn't it? He also never takes it off. As you might be able to tell, Traoré is no regular military strongman. He either is a genuine Sankara acolyte, despite being born after Sankara's death, or as a young military captain, he was smart enough to connect himself to the most popular leader that Burkina Faso has ever had. It would be a bit like in 30 years if a loud, fake-tanned game show host called Ronald Grump ran for president, minus the popular part, I suppose. He was also smart to not only mirror both Sankara's look and rise to power, but also his policies. Traoré, or maybe we'll just call him Sankara 2.0, has a fierce anti-Western and anti-imperialist stance. Go figure. And much like his predecessor, he's willing to take bold actions on his principles. He ended pretty much all cooperation with France, including expelling French troops from the country in 2023. Instead, Traoré chose the regional powers of Mali and Niger to ally with. Together, the three nations left the ECOWAS regional bloc and the G5 Sahel Security Alliance. And to be honest, we can understand that second one because the words Sahel Security Alliance sounds about as effective as the vacuum cleaners for Chernobyl Association. I mean, have you seen the Sahel lately? Traoré also cultivated a new relationship for the nation, Russia, as you can see from this picture of Traoré towering over diminutive KGB manlet Vladimir Putin when they met. This alliance is somewhat logical if you consider the pseudo-Marxist ideology of Sankara, Russia's growing presence in Africa, and the deep animosity for France that drives Traoré's contemporary anti-Western views. Instead of French troops, Russian Wagner mercenaries would help out Burkinabe forces in the region. Initially, the government denied it was hiring Wagner mercenaries to try and take back control of large proportions of the country. Wagner were also in Mali and Niger at the time before the organization was subsumed into the Russian armed forces. Since, though, Traoré has stated that Russian instructors will train its soldiers and that Russian troops could be deployed to help quell the insurgency if required, because nothing screams anti-imperialist like needing a foreign superpower's troops to fight your enemies. Traoré first started to catch the attention of other African citizens when he spoke at the Russia-Africa Summit in 2023. In the speech, he was critical of Africa's leaders, telling them to, quote, "stop behaving like puppets who dance every time the imperialists pull the strings." Of course, Moscow loves that kind of political rhetoric because it plays into its own narratives of anti-Westernism, even if they are in part trying to impose their own imperialism on the likes of Georgia and Ukraine, among others. But Traoré didn't care. His beef wasn't with Russia, it was with the West. And could you blame him? For Pan-Africans like Traoré, for centuries, Western countries and companies had arrived on Africa's shores, pilfering its people, plundering its profits, and propping up politicians so corrupt that if integrity was the national currency, they couldn't afford a bus ticket. From that perspective, anything looks better than a Western alliance that seems to have a vested interest in keeping Africa poor. African people have, for the most part, watched the ill-gotten gains of elites that came with Western foreign investment. All that money gets spent, all those resources mined out of the ground, and Africa is still desperately poor. The West isn't helping them. If anything, it was still stealing from them. So a strange bedfellow in Moscow was found, and a voice for that anger was found in Traoré. Traoré even attended commemorations in Russia in 2025 to mark the 80th anniversary of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in World War II, amongst a bunch of other world leaders. He would later post on X that he, along with military leaders from neighboring Mali and Niger, were inspired by it to combat terrorism and imperialism on their home soil. Geopolitics creates some interesting crossovers sometimes, but a Pan-Africanist Russophile is definitely one that I'm certain not many had on their bingo card back in 2022 when assessing who might be next to take over. And you know what? Traoré is extremely popular not just in his own country, but across Africa and even in certain African expat communities across the world. He is the one who has spearheaded the ongoing nationalization campaign of the nation's gold mines and its burgeoning gold reserve. For Traoré, it's crucial that Burkina Faso starts to see benefits from the immense material wealth that it has. Traoré has set up a state-owned mining company that requires foreign firms to both give it a 15% stake in their local operations and to transfer skills to the Burkinabe people. This rule even applies for the Russian company Nordgold, which was granted a fat new contract and mining license after Traoré came to power. Traoré has another thing going for him: the narrative. As a young leader of an extremely young country, he more than most knows the power that social media can have on shifting public narratives. Remember, Traoré only got the support to launch his coup because of the purported inability of 5-second President Namiba to deal with the continuing Islamist insurgency. Traoré needs to make sure he's not deposed the same way, and a key way to stay in power, even in difficult military circumstances, is popular support. We've seen how coups can fail if the population rises up. Burkina Faso itself from 2015 is an excellent example. That also tells us that the Burkinabe spirit, as positive as it is, can be used as a political weapon to keep Traoré in power. One key way of keeping that support is through slick social media campaigns. Pages like Traoré Vision or Traoré Builds Africa promote a charismatic leader who is shocking the West and pursuing a secret master plan to transform Burkina Faso into Pan-African economic powerhouse. Secret master plans that only these highly publicized social media accounts seem to know about, which is weird. Meanwhile, AI-generated videos of music from stars like R. Kelly, Rhiannon, Justin Bieber, and Beyoncé are seen immortalizing him through song. Although I'd be careful on the R. Kelly endorsement next time, Ibrahim. But it's not all silly celebrity AI slop. AI-generated images have also depicted mass fictional demonstrations in Nairobi, Harare, Kampala, and even New York's Times Square in support for the Traoré regime. That has the potential to be genuinely dangerous if deployed at the wrong moment. His appeal is even still growing, including among Afro-Caribbean citizens of Western nations. According to Beverly Ochieng, a senior researcher at global consultancy firm Control Risks, Traoré has captured the revolutionary Pan-Africanist zeitgeist, stating, quote, "Traoré's impact is huge. I have even heard politicians and authors in countries like Kenya in East Africa say, 'This is it. He is the man.' His messages reflect the age we are living in, when many Africans are questioning the relationship with the West and why there is so much poverty in such a resource-rich continent." End quote. And yet it's not all rosy for Traoré. Naturally, French President Macron isn't keen, describing Traoré as a, quote, "Baroque alliance between self-proclaimed Pan-Africans and neo-imperialists." He's referring to China and Russia here, who both are heavily invested in influencing Africa. Traoré must know that Moscow and Beijing see his regime as an alliance of convenience in a geopolitically important region, but Ouagadougou has put a lot of eggs in the Russia basket. The insurgency isn't going overly well. Maybe expelling those French troops was a bad idea, practically, even if it aligned politically. Russia's ability to actually support Burkina Faso is waning by the day, while Ukraine and Russia grind each other down to powder in Europe. It would be interesting to know Traoré's opinions on the Africans who have been kidnapped by Russia through fake job offers and press-ganged into military service. Naturally, it could cause tension between the nations. After all, the only thing they have in common is their hatred of the West. The nation's focus on Traoré through social media is largely a distraction from the insurgency continuing to get worse, like a band-aid stuck over the bleeding stump of a traumatic amputation. You can only hide that sort of thing from your citizens for so long, and people might start to feel differently about his junta if bullets start flying in their hometowns. Although some assert that this new social media strategy effectively recruits citizens themselves to police and spread propaganda both online and in person. Justin Jager, an exiled Burkinabe journalist based in Sweden, stated that, quote, "I remember people responding to our investigation by saying, 'We don't care, even if it's propaganda. All that matters is that their,' meaning Traoré's government, 'is right about France.'" End quote. Traoré has to be careful, because he came to power on the assumption and vow that he would end the insurgency and end it quickly. He promised sure defeat for the jihadists within 6 months and elections within a year. None of that happened. But that's hardly surprising. This is bigger than Traoré. All across the Sahel and Maghreb, jihadist violence is on the rise. Of course, Traoré knew that, being a military man, but it sounded good on TV. Perhaps he just didn't think ahead to what might happen if he overpromised and underdelivered. 6 months after taking control, he stated that elections were not a priority for the country. Understandable with the war on your front porch, but Traoré's authoritarian tendencies paint a stark picture about the direction of Burkina Faso. Under certain laws passed by the Traoré regime, the government is now able to strip Burkinabe citizenship from individuals who publicly criticize the president. But that's not going to help him if he can't get the damn insurgency under control. Traoré might be a charismatic and principled leader, at least on the surface, but this game isn't really about leaders. It's about building institutions of accountability and finding the right balance of power, even among military juntas or dictatorships, in order to make the country secure. So for all the positives people can ascribe to Traoré, if the situation gets bad enough, we may well see coup number 9 soon enough. So given all that then, how's Burkina Faso doing today? Well, let's just say, not great. According to Paul Melly, an expert on the Sahel region at geopolitical think tank Chatham House, an estimated 70% of the country is under the control of armed groups, terrorists, radical Islamists, militias, and more. At least that was the assessment as of late 2025. Other firms put the number at closer to 60%, but either way, the majority of the country is just straight up out of the government's control, which of course doesn't bode overly well for Traoré given his promises. Burkina Faso now represents the epicenter of a wider Islamic jihadist problem that currently exists in West Africa. But just how this conflict is bigger than Traoré, it's bigger than the nation itself as well. And that's kind of a problem. Jihadists can move across borders from one nation to another when things get dicey, and without sufficient cross-border security arrangements, this will forever be a never-ending game of whack-a-mole, just with fewer high scores and more vests rigged with Semtex. Large swaths of the country are totally cut off right now, which effectively leaves the citizens to fend for themselves. And whilst the Burkinabe have spirit, unfortunately, they lose more fights than they win, and it's not close. On August the 24th, 2024, militants attacked the northern town of Barcelogo, killing hundreds of civilians. It's just one massacre of many. Not even NGOs can get access to some areas, and only military aid can reach a few villages sparingly. Others get nothing and end up getting slaughtered by the Islamists all the same. Food insecurity is rising, millions have been displaced, amounting to a little under 10% of the population, and to be honest, it's a miracle that that number isn't higher. When it's not the jihadists killing civilians, though, the government seems to be able to step in and fulfill that role just fine. International human rights groups, as well as the European Union and UN, have accused Burkina Faso of serious human rights violations, including the indiscriminate killings and forced disappearances of dozens of civilians.